Welcome, everyone. We'll be getting started in just about 1 minute as people log in. Good morning or afternoon, folks. As you join us, we'll be getting started in just a moment. Welcome, everybody. Let's go ahead and get started. The one piece of housekeeping that I'd like to share with everyone before we jump into today's webinar is our code of conduct. My colleagues will gladly share the link to our code of conduct. And please take a moment to familiarize yourself with that. Any unwelcome or disruptive behavior will result in a removal. And if you see it or if it's directed to you, please message us and one of my colleagues will take appropriate action. With that, I'd like to welcome everybody to today's webinar. This is one of the most frequently asked questions that we encounter as we administer the OSF Research Registry. One of the main features in that is helping to guide researchers to fully pre-specify their study and their analysis plans. And given the variety of research that exists out there, there is a variety of different templates to guide you through that process. And choosing the right one can be a daunting first step as you're getting started with that. So Crystal and I will be going through the templates that we have, talking a little bit about why they exist and specifically when to use or not to use any given template. I should say that the uh, webinar will be recorded and shared afterwards, and slides will be as well. So we're going to go through a lot of content. There's some text-heavy slides. You'll be able to reference this in the future. Just to get started, I can't help myself but to give a brief definition of just exactly what preregistration is and some of the purposes behind it. However, I expect if you're on this webinar, the majority of you probably know this, so I won't go down into too many details. But of course, a pre-registration is just a time-stamped read-only version of a research plan that's going to be posted into a public registry. And those two asterisks mean that they can be updated if that's transparently made available. And the public registry often includes, as the OSF does, uh, features to embargo the public release of those study plans. We do encounter some different terminology across different methods and different disciplines. For the sake of simplicity, if you hear these types of phrases, registration, prospective registration, pre-analysis plans, some of these have slightly different nuance about exactly what they are. But again, for the sake of simplicity, if you hear us use some of these terms, or if you hear others, of course, use these terms, you should probably just assume that they mean about the same thing. And as I mentioned, the read-only research plans, we won't go into too many of the features available on the OSF registry. But if you create a registration, you do have the ability to edit that in the future. But there is an indication, there's a trail of what those changes were and why they were made in order to add transparency and context to when that is. And especially when we get to some of the other templates, especially the one using existing data, we'll go into some of the detail about why that is. You know, essentially the amount of knowledge you have about the data might affect um, uh, the inferences that you can make from the proposed analyses. But as with many cases, context and clarity and transparency into when and why those changes were made can help alleviate those concerns. Right now, we've got 11 templates on the OSF registry for different types of use cases. Several more are in the works, and we work with community members and discipline experts to review or solicit new ones. And this is likely to be an ever-changing number as we curate which ones we offer on the OSF. The purpose of these templates is to make sure that you've got enough information to fulfill the purposes of the pre-registration. And there are different types of purposes for different methods. Sometimes it's to help increase the so-called or to open the so-called file drawer, just to help community members and other scholars understand how much research is conducted every year, regardless of how much ends up getting published in a traditional journal. Oftentimes, benefits of registration are to address practices commonly known as p-hacking. So essentially, setting your study and analysis plan ahead of time before you see any of the data can help make sure that the assumptions of the statistical tests that you're using are being met. And there's a couple of other different nuances or potential benefits about improving study design or about addressing issues around publication bias, and we'll get to a couple of those as well. The templates that are available on the OSF, some of them are extremely bare bones. They don't provide much structure at all. Some of them are very thorough and provide a lot of structure, and choosing the right one is an important first consideration. With that, I'm going to pass it to, oh, no, one more thing, I apologize. The I just wanted to give you a heads up about where you'll be encountering this decision. There are two different workflows where you can enter the registry. First one is at osf.io/registries. This is the homepage of that. And there are a number of branded registries. The OSF is the biggest and broadest ones. Some funders and some institutions have their own. The workflow looks similar for those branded ones as this OSF general one. If you go here and click on Add New, you'll get to a page where you are asked if you are going to register a project you already have on OSF. If you're starting this for the first time, you'll select No, and then you'll be asked which type of registration would you like to create, and that's when you'll make this first decision. The other place where you can register your project is from an OSF project. An OSF project is a live working space for you and your collaborators to share materials, to post code or research instruments or data. You can write narrative descriptions of your research plan there. It's essentially a project management page, and you can freeze that project management page. You can register it when you're about ready to collect your first bit of data. That's a typical time to do that. And if you would like to do that, you would select the registrations tab, and from the tab there, you'll be given to again select one of the 11 options for a pre-registration template. So those are the two times that you'll encounter this question of which template would you like to use. Now I'm going to hand it over to Crystal to talk about our two most popular pre-registration templates. Crystal, take it away.
Thanks, David. So the OSF pre-registration template and the aspredicted.org pre-registration template are among our most popular templates. They're very general purpose, so they provide some general guidance for researchers in order to share study plans for projects that don't have like a more specific template available. So these are also great for first-time registrations. The aspredicted.org template is very, very simple. On the next slide in a second, we kind of show the difference between very similar questions between the two templates. And so the aspredicted.org template is very, very It's very simple, very straightforward. The OSF pre-registration template has a few more guided questions that have just a little bit more detail and encourage you to add more information. And these two are both great for use when you don't have a more specific template that's available for your research type. And so we can kind of look at the difference just kind of to highlight that between the two. So if David, you want to go to the next slide. So as you can see on the right, the aspredicted.org template for sample size, it just asks how many observations are going to be collected. You don't need to justify the decision. Just be precise about how that number is going to be determined. So you can see it's just a text box, and then so you enter in that information. On the left side, the OSF pre-registration template has a few more questions that kind of prompt you to provide just a bit more information around what the kind of sample is, how you get it. You might add information about how you're going to stop collecting data, all of that kind of information. So these two templates are really great for starting out. If you've never pre-registered before, or if you can't find a template that is specific to your type of research, it may be worth selecting one of these two to look at. And then the next one is for generalized systematic review. So this template that we have is great for pre-registering systematic reviews, scoping reviews, meta-analyses, and similar projects. It includes a lot of questions that probe at the exact search strategy that you're going to use. So questions about what databases you're going to use, what interfaces you're using, your inclusion and exclusion criteria, your query strings, validation strategies that you're going to use. So these are really, really helpful for those types of projects. They're less helpful for ones that involve more like experimentation or anything like that. And then the example of what that might look like would be here are some questions from that. So the questions about the type of review, the different review stages, like that you're going to use to conduct a review, all of the entities that you're going to extract. And they have examples, some nice guiding examples in the actual text itself. So you can see for entities to extract, you can see that they kind of prompt you to say, okay, are you going to have independent and dependent variables? You're going to have moderators? Are you going to look at means, standard deviations? Like, what are you going to be reporting out? And really prompting you to like think about, okay, what am I looking for? What am I going to actually report out? And how can I like best organize this information in a way that's going to be useful for other people? And so this template has those types of questions in there to really make sure that if somebody wants to come in and try to reproduce your search, or if they're wanting to do a similar search, that they're able to really understand what it is that you did, what steps you took, what you included and excluded, and what you're reporting out and why. So really, really helpful for that type of project. And then we've also got a template in pre-registration for social psychology. So this is really great for social psychological research and stuff in similar fields, particularly for quantitative work. So if you're doing experiments or observational studies, particularly with human subjects, this template's really, really good for that. And that helps to it really has a focus on your hypotheses, your methods, your analysis plan, what variables you're going to include, what your sample size is, how you're going to determine who's going to be included or excluded, how you're justifying your sample size. And so it's going to be really, really appropriate for those types of studies. And so, what that can look like, some of the questions, you can see that there's specific questions that kind of break out specifically your independent variables, whether they're, within or between participants, what the relationship is between them, your dependent variables, or if you're doing a correlational design, that's where you would put those, and then any kinds of covariates or moderators or anything that you have going on there. And then there's also some stuff around confirmatory analyses and exploratory analyses, what variables you're going to be using, what kind of statistical techniques you're going to be using. And you really get to like specifically fill in prompts around those things so you can ensure that all of that is planned out and that you're reporting it. And then for qualitative, I'm a mixed methods researcher, so I often get questions about qualitative pre-registration around why do it, and especially since a lot of qualitative researchers aren't necessarily interested in confirmatory hypotheses. They might not have hypotheses going into a study. This qualitative template takes that into account, and it's really helpful for planning a qualitative study so that you can kind of document the assumptions and beliefs that you're taking into the study, and your credibility strategies that you're going to use throughout the process. There's a lot of focus on what the process is for you to collect data, and it was developed with qualitative researchers to fit in, which is actually true for most, if not all, of our pre-registration templates. We've developed them with those communities. And so there are questions in there around credibility strategies, about positionality, and so it's really nice of a focus on updating the process as you go throughout the study. So not necessarily locking you into a specific set of hypotheses, but encouraging you to kind of list out what your research questions are, what results you might expect to find, how you're going to know when to stop collecting data, and all of that. So some of the questions from that template include things like a list that you can kind of check off of different kinds of credibility strategies that you're going to use. And there's also a box, I didn't put it on here, but there's a box after that that asks you to justify like why you're using those strategies, why they're appropriate for your design. And then there's also questions about like your positionality, where you can talk about your relationship to the phenomenon that you're studying, and how all those different standpoints interact with one another. And then I think that's you, David.
Yeah. Um, Rana, I saw your question in the webinar chat. Um, and here I'm going to give an answer to it. So I don't like to pick favorites, but if I did have to pick a favorite, I would say this is one of mine, because this template was started as a hackathon, or as a topic for a hackathon working group at the Society for the Improvement of Psychological Science, SIPS. I believe their next unconference is taking place this summer in Budapest, so check that out if you're interested in it. Lots of great work happens there. But back to the topic at hand, when you are using a study, as a lot of research does, where the data set already exists somewhere, that could be privately available, or it could be from some large public database. Obviously, fields such as economics uses large existing data sets for a lot of their work. Um, or you are using a data set that's associated with some published research that happened to have an openly available data set with it. Whatever the case is, or in Rihanna's case even, data collection might have already started. There are potential issues doing purely confirmatory hypothesis testing research when the data set already exists. And this template is designed to help address that, that type of concern. So the potential problem is what's known as parking, where you create hypothesis already knowing or having some inclination of trends in the data set that might be similar to the results you're hoping to find. And so that is a form of bias that could invalidate the statistical tests, depending on how much knowledge you have and how precisely that knowledge is used to inform the test you're using, and the exact nature of the statistical methods. All that being said, is the purpose of this data set is to help tease out those potential issues, describe your knowledge of the data set, any steps that have been taken to address those potential issues, and in some cases sort of guide you to different analyses that might be more appropriate. So a couple of the questions in this registration template are very similar to all the other ones that the OSF offers, but it does have a couple of additional sections about your knowledge of the data and steps you're going to take to address those potential biases. So this is obviously a good template to use if you're relying on data that's already been collected or you might have some knowledge of. The next is, I believe, one of the oldest templates available on the OSF. This is from a publication back in around 2014, where Brandt et al. Described the information needed to pre-specify when you are conducting a replication study. So a replication, and more precisely, a direct replication that is independent from prior authors. The purpose of these types of studies is to um, try to retest that precise question that was originally addressed in that first publication. There are other types of replications. Uh, the common phrase is a conceptual replication, where the scholars who are conducting the work change some variable, some social context or some environmental context or something else about the study, and want to address a similar but a slightly different uh, research question. When conducting a direct replication, you're really focused on that precise question as it was specified in that first publication. And this template leads you, the researcher who's doing the replication, to articulate what those issues are, and then how you're going to try to make the next study as similar to the original study as possible. Also, I should mention that this is actually two templates. So there's a pre-registration uh, that gets you to articulate these items ahead of time to pre-specify issues such as how you're going to determine whether or not the replication is successful. And I use that term successful a little bit. I don't like that word. I put it in quotes. Um, Whether or not it shows the same type of evidence as the originally published study, or if it does not support the original conclusions. The second template is the replication recipe post-study. This is just, as I mentioned very early on in the webinar, you can take a snapshot of your project at various points in time. That second template can be used when you're finished your study as an earmark, as a marker that the study is completed, and a place for you to draft some of your early conclusions before writing up for publication. The this template will ask you to what degree are you trying to replicate the original study, how much you think these are exactly or close or quite different from the original conditions. And as I mentioned, one of the important features there is the criteria you use to determine whether or not this was a successful replication. Pre-specifying that is important for lots of reasons that are relevant to today's topic. Essentially, if you don't pre-specify it and you wait till the end to determine whether or not it was successful, that can be quite a biased moment because you can use various hindsight biases to uh, push the evidence in the way that you might want to see it one way or the other. So it's important to pre-specify those types of decisions as much as you're able to. This next one, this penultimate template, is for when you are working with a journal on a publishing format known as registered reports. So what is a registered report? That is when you submit the proposed study design to a journal before you conduct the study, obviously. The proposed study, the rationale, and the proposed data collection procedures and analyses, those themselves undergo peer review, and the journal with feedback from reviewers will decide if the study is worth doing, and if so, are the proposed methods and analyses appropriate to address the question. If yes, and that might be a few rounds of review to get to a yes, they will promise to publish the final results regardless of the main outcomes of the study. That's called IPA, or in principle acceptance. When they give you that promise to publish, it will be based on a manuscript that's been revised a few times, and that is the item that you're going to register. That's what you want to lock in. So this form is very simple. It asks you for the name of the journal, when IPA occurred, and then there's a simple upload widget to attach the manuscript and any other materials that are that have undergone peer review or that you'd like to archive at that time. So again, just the name of the journal and a space to attach your manuscript. Don't use this template if you have a preprint you'd like to share, or if you haven't received in principle acceptance from a journal. It's for that one specific use case. And more information about register reports is available on the website cos.io/RR. And maybe one of my colleagues can put, yep, have already done that. Thank you. All right, and last and kind of least is are these two templates, the open-ended and the OSF standard pre-data collection. Uh, I say that a little bit jokingly, not to disparage anything, but let me just mention that these are the most bare bones templates. The purpose of these is to give you a way to register your project and to attach any files you want to it. But the information that is available to put in those fields is very bare bones, just sort of describes the project, allows you to attach a file. Most of the information included in that is going to be embedded in whatever files you upload, which is less machine readable, and it becomes a little bit more difficult to discover for others to discover through searching information that you put up there. People might use these more bare bones templates if they very much want to write out the narrative, their pre-analysis plan in the format they very much want to write it out, and attach it to OSF, and that's fine. We enable and encourage that. I think that's uh, an appropriate way to do it if you want to write out your research plans in that format in a Word document and attach it to the registry in that way. This enables that. But if you're new to pre-registration or you don't know what to include, or especially if you want the information in there to be as discoverable as possible through the search fields that are enabled by using one of the templates, if any of those apply, then I'd recommend not using one of these templates. So these are, again, some of the what those fields look like. They're very basic, asks you whether or not the study's been conducted, gives you a spot to attach your whatever document you've created, and that's about it. So with that, I think we have gone through the entirety of the OSF registry as it stands right now. We'll give an updated webinar maybe in a year or two's time, because I do expect we'll have a couple of more at that point. So it's ever evolving as feedback from the community comes, and as we figure out what's being used to the benefit of our mission. But until then, that is all the templates we have available. And so we'll be happy to take any questions that come through either the Q&A or the chat at this time. Or I'll start with a question for Crystal. Crystal, is anything I said, do you disagree with or want to add on to?
No, I don't think so. We did get a question in the Q&A that you kind of just addressed, but I didn't know if you want to, if there's anything additional that you would want to add around. We got a question that is there any downside of writing just an individual prereg without a template and uploading it? I felt like you addressed that, but I didn't know if there was anything else you wanted to add to that in your experience working with pre-registration.
Yeah, it's there was an evaluation conducted about 4 or 5 years ago now, that compared registrations that had used I think the OSF pre-registration, that our default fairly thorough one, and pre-registrations that were done through a narrative description of the project. and it found that the ones that simply use the narrative description attached as a document um, missed more crucial information than the templated ones. And so, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, if you're relatively new to the process or you don't quite know what to include in your pre-registration, it might be too easy to miss important details if you don't use one of the recommended templates. Mark?
Yeah, so I actually have a question. What if a researcher is using or is completing a research, but none of the templates are currently matching their study design or their discipline? What should they do?
That's a good question. So the both as predicted and OSF pre-registration are the most broadly applicable and can fit virtually any research design. To the degree that they do not, or that it's asking questions that do not apply to the methods that are being used, that is an appropriate response to any field, does not apply or not applicable.
Okay. I have a follow-up question then, which is what if they found a template that's not available on the OSF and they would like to use it?
They should send it to us and we'll evaluate it. Is that, yeah, so Mark and I are on the pre-registration template advisory committee, and submissions to that, can you post a link to that call for templates? It might be
Absolutely.
appropriate. And you can send it our way or just send it to us through the help desk through our general contact form, and we'll direct you to that page. And there's a process that we've been initiating for the past year or two to take suggestions from the community, review them for whether or not they are appropriate to be included. And we're working to get a couple of more up in the near future, I know. And we've got a sort of a backlog of recommendations on there. So that's the process by which we hope to expand and improve the options available to you.
And I think like in the meantime, if you need to pre-register before that template approval process can go through, one thing that you can do is use that template in a Word doc. That would also be like an appropriate use of the open-ended registration where, for instance, there is a pre-registration template based on the American Psychological Association's journal article reporting standard or JARS. And so sometimes people use that to pre-register, and that's not a template that we currently have on the OSF. So they might download that template into like a Word document or whatever your favorite text processing software is, and then edit it appropriately, make sure that you filled out everything. And then that is something that you can upload then using the open-ended registration. So you would upload that file. In the summary, you would provide a description of it, and you might also include like this is based off of the APHR's template or whatever. And then so then you can still pre-register it. You can still use that template. But that if you need to pre-register before we can get that through our system, that's one way to do that.
Yeah, that's a great point. That might be a great alternative use for those open-ended registrations. Just using a Word doc that way. There, Kelly is asking, Rihanna and Kelly have questions in the chat here. Is there a way to safeguard against information being used essentially by AI scraping? I believe not. You can license your registrations, the content in the registration. There is a licensing feature. To be frank, I don't know the degree to which that is
I think
effective.
that's still being determined by a lot of court cases, like the extent to which copyrighted material is actually protected by AI. But in the meantime, that's kind of the advice that everybody's been giving for hosting any kind of material online is just make sure that you license it. So that is something that we require, if I remember correctly, for registrations. Selecting an appropriate license is going to be a good starting point for that.
And we
But
have more
it's a
help.
kind of a bigger issue than costs in terms of like what AI models are allowed to use.
Yeah, and we have some help guides about choosing the right license to help figure it out there. Kelly asks, advise on which template to use for a critical realist literature review. And as you mentioned, yeah, I think the first one, OSF registration, is generally the best bet. Um, Depending on exactly how quantitative it is, the general systematic review template um, might be more appropriate. So take a look at those two templates before you make your final decision. But OSF pre-reg is a good general purpose. And depending on what your literature review looks like and what you're um, gathering from that process, how quantitative that process is, that generalized systematic review is would be my next recommendation.
And we also have some questions in the Q&A. One's from Annette. I've studied to pre-register. It's exploratory. It's based on survey data. It's most likely to involve correlations. What template is best? I would take a look. You could look at that OSF pre-registration one, that first one that we talked about. Another one that might be helpful to look at is pre-registration in social psychology. That one may also be useful. And I posted in the chat, but we can post it again. You can actually download any of these templates as like Word documents or open them in Google Drive and kind of like open them and explore them and type and respond to those prompts. So that might be something where you just might open both of those, both the OSF pre-registration one and the pre-registration and social psychology, and just kind of compare those questions and see which ones feel like they are best addressed or they best address what your study is covering. I don't know if you have additional advice on that, David.
No, yeah, I think that's a good recommendation. I guess I'll add one more thing. Sorry, I can't help myself. Registering exploratory research can be relatively bare bones. Essentially asserting you're doing an exploratory process. You think there might be a lot of interesting correlations. The conclusions or the generalizations you're going to draw from this are limited and are likely mostly to be used for follow-up research. Stating something like that in a simple pre-registration is fine, and it's a little bit of a promise to your future self not to go crazy and say, I found this correlation and that's the answer to the universe. And so not to overgeneralize from an exploratory process. Using a fairly concise one, such as predicted, could be appropriate for your purposes there. Anonymous asks, when should you be pre-registering? What's the earliest or the latest that it can happen? So I generally recommend that you pre-register right before, if you're collecting your own data and it's a typical process like that, pre-register as close to that start of data collection as is feasible. Things change all the time, especially in that planning stage. Lots of things are happening. You can put your draft into the OSF relatively early on. As you refine your plans, you can change that as needed. You can, of course, as I mentioned early, change later after you register with those transparent changes. But you don't want to do that if you don't need to. And if there's going to be a chunk of a couple of months between when you have made your plan and when you're actually starting data collection, in reality, things change during that window. And so you might as well register right about when you're about to start collection. I think that's kind of the ideal spot. Others can disagree, of course, but that does give you the most flexibility in revising your plans. And I'll just also mention the issue with piloting a study. If you're not going to use the data, if you're going to test your methods with a couple of subjects or a couple of small data collection efforts just to make sure that the methods work, you don't have to pre-register that. You can just sort of do that, change what needs to be changed, the order of how you do things or whatever. And then use the lessons learned to make any revisions to your procedures. And then once those changes are made, pre-register and then start the data collection for the data that you're going to use in your study. That's also a very appropriate time to do that. Crystal, any other?
Also worth noting that several of the templates actually ask you what part of data collection you're in, so, or what the state of the data is, so you can select, like, I haven't collected the data yet, or data collection has started but it's not complete, or, you know, I've looked at the data, I've actually run some analyses on it, so you can actually like select what it is, and all it does is it just tells your audience like the extent to which that data might have informed, you know, predictions or conclusions that you're making as you're pre-registering. So I agree with David. Like earlier is definitely better. There are some cases where you absolutely can't. For instance, I've pre-registered a study before where we had actually gotten institutional data. So our institution used to, you know, send out a survey to all of the undergraduates, and then we could ask them to ask questions in that survey, and then we would get that data. And so we were just waiting for the raw data, and they sent us the summaries. And so like we saw the summaries, like we didn't ask for them, but we saw them because they sent them, and they were very, very basic summaries that didn't actually tell us anything really about what we were asking about. But so we did disclose that. We did say like, here's the summary, right, that we got from the institution while we were waiting for the raw data, right? So you can do that, like there are places for you to disclose that within a lot of the templates. And just also a reminder, especially for folks that are doing like exploratory research, but this is also true for everybody, is that on the OSF, pre-registrations can be updated. So if at some point you have to throw some data out, or you have to change the way that you're collecting data, or maybe you realize your sample size was too small and you have to increase it, or anything like that, you can go in and you can update that. It'll ask you to justify the changes that you're making. And that can be as simple. I've seen pre-registrations where they're like, I made a typo. When just nobody on this 8-person team caught it before it got posted. You know, and just stuff like that happens. And then sometimes people say like, you know, I read a paper that made me realize my plan for analyzing this data was wrong or something. So you can make those changes. You can update them. The OSF versions those pre-registrations so people can kind of see what's going on there.
Yeah, there are a lot of interesting issues to consider with the updating, and they're really interesting to sort of go down the rabbit hole and think about what the implications of different changes are. Especially if you see a typo that makes understanding what you're saying difficult. If it does affect clarity, go ahead and change that. I would say don't change it if it's just a innocuous typo that doesn't affect clarity or comprehensibility. There sometimes you'll see in the published literature things that should not be said or that are really invalidating the statistical inferences. I've seen papers that have said we collected data until we found statistical significance, which really invalidates the whole process. And so you should be aware that if you're updating your pre-registration just every time you collect a little bit more data, and you're sort of continually hunting for a specific result, it's very good that you're updating your pre-registration and you're saying that. But that frankly does
Not best practice.
It's not best practice. It invalidates what you're really trying to find. And so between those extremes, there's a lot of interesting nuance. And the way to figure out what's going on is through transparency and clarity, seeing how you're updating your information or your methods and for what reason.
We've got a question about pilot study, about if there's a template for pilot studies. I don't know if you'd like to answer that, David.
Yeah, I'll start. No, it might be appropriate to consider that as one of our templates. As I mentioned, it's not necessary to pre-register a pilot study, especially if you don't plan on publishing the results of that pilot study. The definition of pilot study that I use, I think, is appropriate, and it is something to test your methodology to make sure that you are able to do something at scale because you want a sample size of 100 or 1,000, but you don't know if you can reliably get 10 research assistants to do that. And so you train them, or you test your methods to make sure that they are feasible. You don't use that data for your main study. You don't necessarily need to pre-register that. If you do, you can use any of the templates, probably one of the more concise ones, and simply label it pilot study, and describe what you're going to use the data for. I think that would be the way to do it. Annette asks a good question of sort of follow up on these existing data and making changes. It is tricky, but the main answer is to go into is that none of these processes are meant to stop a fraudster who wants to cook the books in any sort of way. There are ways around that, and that's disingenuous. If you're going into it with good intent, simply sort of describe the changes that you're making at the time, and the reason you're doing so. Documenting that is a way to keep yourself honest to your intentions. And whether or not it's intentional or not, the effects of documenting it on a public registry level the playing field. I think it's the best way to describe it. Crystal, do you have another perspective on that?
Yeah, and I think just generally, kind of no matter whatever we tell folks best practices, like there's always going to be a way, like I think, around those things. And so like the best thing that we can do as a field is to enact strong norms and to kind of work together to make sure that folks are aware of like why you pre-register, what the purpose of it is, what the benefits of it are, and kind of just encourage being good stewards of the scientific process.
Joanna asked a question that I really like because this is something that we're considering specifically doing. So a lot of funding agencies in particular require data management plans, and that in some ways can there can be a lot of overlap between that and a pre-registration, depending on exactly what information you put in your data management plan. Um, so So they can serve very similar purposes. There could be a time when there's a template call to data manage a plan prior to each study. For the time being, the to answer your question very directly, the difference is the DMP is something that you would just send to the funder, and if you want to publish that in some way, you could do it in many different ways by putting it into the registry, or making your OSF project publicly available and giving it a DOI. That could be another way to do it. If you want to use the registry for that, I would say go ahead and use the default OSF pre-reg template, and use the information that you've already written down for your data management plan, and you'll probably fill out most of the required fields in that. And I don't believe most data management plans would ask about your analysis plans, but there might be some basic outlines of an analysis plan in that. And if so, you can start to put that in your pre-registration, something that you've already created for the grant application.
Yeah, we get this question sometimes also with like ethics review forms as well, where people are like, is that the same thing as like an IRB? That's what it's often called in the US, IRB application. And the answer is that they just serve different purposes. The data management plan is often focused on what kind of data collection what kind of data you're going to collect, how you're going to talk about like the metadata, what you're going to do to share and to archive that information, where you're going to store it. And that's not necessarily like the same thing as what's in a lot of these templates around, the data that's being collected. It's more about why you're collecting that particular type of data, what kinds of data you're going to collect, and how you're going to analyze it. So there may be overlap, and you can certainly reuse the information across that. Same thing with IRB stuff that's supposed to focus on ethics, which there may be some aspects of design in that. And so you can reuse a lot of the information across these forms, but they are serving different purposes. So there are some questions on a DMP that wouldn't be relevant to pre-registration, and vice versa. There's some stuff on a pre-registration template that wouldn't really be relevant to a data management plan. So there is some overlap, but they also do serve some pretty specific purposes. So it is a different thing. We've also got a question about are there templates for pre-registering experiments maybe on text corpora? What might be an appropriate use case for that? I don't know, David, if you have some initial thoughts.
I don't.
Yeah, for like NLP, probably like natural language processing. I might take that may be one where we might not have a template on the OSF for it yet, but there may be one out there that may be useful. But I think if there isn't a template that's speaking to you of the ones that we've covered, I would check that OSF pre-registration or the as predicted one and start from there. But there are some pretty specific things that go into NLP that may be beneficial. Another place that folks can sometimes start is by looking up reporting guidelines. So if there are reporting guidelines specifically for papers that talk about NLP, you can kind of, again, use that open-ended pre-registration template, but like pull from those reporting guidelines and just make sure that you have that information filled out. Like that might be an option. And then Viviana asks, would a scale standardization require a pre-registration? So if you're planning to translate an existing scale for a community in another country, David, you look like you might have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'm thinking as you're reading it. If there are, especially if there are criteria that will determine whether or not you've sort of appropriately um, uh, standardized or met some pre-existing criteria threshold for validating whether or not that's been done correctly. In that case, I think it would be appropriate to pre-register that process. Yeah, that would be the one question to ask.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think there are a lot of decisions that go into translating scales into like other languages, for instance. Like some folks do back translations, some don't. You might be using different methods for translating. It may be good to outline those in advance, and to see like there may be other researchers who use other methods, and then there can be some comparisons there. There are also different cutoff points that folks use for whether something's a good fit, or whether the internal reliability and all that kind of stuff, whether it's at an acceptable measure or not. So like stating those in advance so you're not tempted to later be like, oh, well, this is supposed to be like a 0.8 and it's like a 0.78, and like maybe that's good enough. Like, so you don't get tempted to kind of do that. So I think that there's especially when you have to like outlining what you think that those good cutoff points are going to be, it may be good to use pre-registration for that. So that would be what I would think to do.
I agree with that. All right. I appreciate everyone who took the time to join us today. We'll be following up with an email with a link to the slides and maybe a couple of the links for information that we referenced in today's webinar. As always, reach out to us through our help desk, through our contact page if you have follow-up questions, or ask on social media platforms, and we'll do our best to answer. Have a great day. Bye-bye.